As the world recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, the one thing that stares at all of us is the rise in economic inequality, the rich-poor divide across the world. The latest World Inequality Report highlights the extent of wealth and income inequalities between and within countries. The richest 10% of the global population currently take home 52% of the total income. In contrast, the poorest half of the global population earn just 8%. And when it comes to wealth, which includes valuable assets and items over and above income, the gap is even wider. The poorest half of the global population owns just 2% of the global total, while the richest 10% owns 76% of all world's wealth. Significant inequality also exists within countries. Over the last 2 decades, while global inequalities between countries declined, income inequality increased within most countries. The average income gap between the top 10% and bottom 50% of individuals within countries almost doubled across that time period. And the COVID pandemic has exacerbated these inequalities, partly reversing the decline of the previous 2 decades. So in a year that marks halfway through the journey to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, how will the world ensure that no one is left behind? What can countries and institutions do to turn the tide on inequality? That's the global debate today. I am Tina Jha. Joining me are distinguished experts on the subject from different parts of the world. So it is my pleasure to welcome on this edition of the Global Debate, Mr. Michael Sheldrick, co-founder and Chief Policy Impact and Government Relations Officer at Global Citizen, Mr. Stanley Achonu, Nigeria Director, One, and Mr. Matthew Cherian, Board Chairperson, Care India. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on the program today on Sunset TV. Mr. Sheldrick, if I could begin the program today with you. So there's been a significant increase in income and wealth inequalities worldwide, as has been highlighted in the Global Inequality Report. So if I could ask you to give us a sense of how these inequalities have exacerbated the crisis globally, and also where has the impact been the largest so far?
Well, this report really reinforces findings from many institutions, including the World Bank, which has seen poverty soar over the last 2 years. It's estimated that nearly 100 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty. And of course, even before the pandemic, progress towards, you mentioned the UN Sustainable Development Goals, wasn't moving as fast as we had hoped. In fact, in certain parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, poverty was already increasing. But what we saw during the pandemic is that many of the inequities that exist in our global society were reinforced, retrenched, and had a horrendous and catastrophic impact. And you saw this particularly in the way that access to vaccinations were rolled out around the world. It's no surprise that the wealthiest countries in the world quickly bought up most vaccine, and were able to return to a sense of normalcy. In other parts of the world, such as across the African continent, you had just 10% of the world vaccinated. And we know that there is a strong correlation between vaccine access and jobs. The International Labour Organization found that for every 14 vaccines correlated with the return of a full-time job. So if you're not getting access to vaccines, you're not seeing the same return in jobs as well. So this is going to take potentially years to recover from. And we need the wealthiest countries and the wealthiest individuals. You mentioned the explosion in private wealth. In some parts of the world, they're literally awash with money. We need them to urgently respond. Otherwise, we are not just going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but we are going to condemn millions of people to a life of substandard living and poverty unnecessarily.
Absolutely. A strong correlation between vaccine equity and economic equity that the world has to look forward to. I'll come back to understand the solutions that that governments must, think of if we are to achieve the sustainable development goal of leaving no one behind, of ensuring that it's a fair and equitable world for every individual. But before that, let me go across to Mr. Stanley Achonu. Mr. Achonu, since your work is predominantly in Africa, let me get in a perspective from you on the kind of economic impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the continent, especially if we are to talk about the consequences in terms of the inequalities that it has brought about.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you again for having me. The impact has been enormous across all sectors. For instance, in 2020 alone, more than 20 to 30 million jobs were lost on the continent due to the pandemic. The hunger level has gotten worse. 250 million children out of school. The chances of getting back to school is 0 to nothing. So we have seen, more people pushed into extreme poverty, not just even poverty, extreme poverty on the continent than ever before due to the impact of the pandemic. And like Michael said, the vaccine availability, and everybody knows about the challenge of Africa faced in accessing vaccine. Even when countries in Africa pay directly to get the vaccine, the richer countries, of course, bought up all of the supplies available and made it near impossible for African countries to be able to access vaccine. And he clearly outlined the impact of vaccine availability, the direct impact between vaccine availability and people's ability to return to jobs. So there is a chance, when you look at the number, there is a chance that it will take longer, as much as 10 years, for Africa to return back to the previous growth rate before the pandemic. So, the biggest impact we've had in the past will be the 2007, 2008 economic crisis, right? But the numbers we are seeing today shows that Africa is even doing far worse in terms of economic numbers, GDP, jobs, people's ability to survive, the number of people who have gone into extreme poverty. Africa is doing far worse than we did during the economic crisis of that period. So it is critically important that beyond that we see recovery as a collective, not as a national. We shouldn't take nationalistic approach to recovery, because, as we say, as long as there is one place where this COVID virus exists, it remains a huge threat to the global economy. It is not a threat only to the country where it exists, but it is a huge threat to global economy.
Absolutely. So going forth, global cooperation is something that is required. No country can work in silos if we are aiming to reduce the inequalities that has been, in fact, widened by the pandemic. Mr. Cherian, so Mr. Stanley has given us a picture of how the situation is like in the African continent. How similar or different is the India story? Before the pandemic, we had seen there were several efforts to improve life standards in the country, and which in fact did lead to a decline in economic inequality. But has the massive impact of the pandemic also rolled back the hard-fought gains in India that we had made in recent years?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. And in India, what has happened is the pandemic has only created a failure of social protection systems. For example, we have a national social assistance program for older people, for disabled people, and for widows, and also for affected by terrorism and other kind of areas. What happened during the pandemic, we all know that the migrants had to go home without any employment, and as a result of it, older people who received any sustenance from them had to decline in poverty. And we only received one top-up pension for older people and widows. And as a result of it, social protection measures have failed completely. And if you look at the inequality report, it also says about 100 million people in India itself have slid into poverty. The other area is the employment programs. Employment programs whether it was a national rural employment program or whether it was small scale employment in the medium and small scale sector, all of them declined. Some of them shut down. Some of them are in dire straits. So the data for India is the 1% rich, the billionaires, they have grown. In fact, they have had 500% increase in profits, whereas the real poor have slid into greater poverty. I would estimate that the poverty figures would have gone up from 33% to maybe close to 45%. There are no official estimates available, but we see this kind of but coming to vaccines, India has been on a lucky footing. We are the largest producer of vaccine, and the government has ensured about more than almost 60 to 70% of the people have received vaccines, and the figure is quite a bit. It's about 1,500 million vaccine doses have been delivered. So these are substantial figures, and we don't have the vaccine inequality which is there, except we have some last mile issues where vaccine is not able to be reached in remote areas, in tribal areas, or in the Himalayan region, etc. So these are some of the constraints that we have. But overall, I said, with it does not leave no one behind. In fact, most people have gone down, and too little assistance have been received for removing them from poverty. And I think we should pay a lot more attention to social protection and to rural employment programs if things have to improve.
Certainly. In fact, India's commitment is to ensure 100% social protection to all individuals. How soon that can happen and whether we will be able to achieve the 2030 target is something that I will dwell upon, and I'll come back to you to understand solutions to this effect. What are the efforts that India has been undertaking? But before that, coming back to you, Mr. Sheldrick, the challenge, as all three of you have spoken of, is huge in terms of inequalities of all kinds, be it economic, social, even gender inequalities across the world. What kind of action now is being taken by the governments to be able to minimize this gap?
Well, if we look at two systemic barriers that really prolonged the impact of the pandemic and ensured it disproportionately impacted the most vulnerable communities in our global society. One of those barriers was, of course, vaccine access, manufacturing and production. And India, perhaps unfairly, early on in the pandemic was really asked by the world to shoulder that burden. In terms of the COVAX vaccine initiative, it sourced almost all of its supply early on from India. And of course, when India, rightly so, dealing with its own explosion in cases over the course of March, April last year, wasn't able to deliver on those vaccines globally, we really showed this crunch and lack of access. And so one of the things coming out of this pandemic to ensure a crisis like this never happens again unnecessarily is to support all regions around the world to be able to manufacture, produce, and deliver vaccines to the most poorest communities in their regions. And so, we've got this situation now where some of the wealthiest pharma companies, instead of supporting these measures, such as the World Health Organization's mRNA hub in South Africa, they're actually filing to protect their patents. And so I think, the proposal that was put on the table by India and South Africa to waive intellectual property rights, measures that look at forcing extraordinary cooperation, compulsory licensing, all of these measures need to be on the table because we can't have this occurring again as a result of healthcare injustice when the world knows what to do and has the means to address it. I think the second big barrier is around giving countries the means themselves as was just noted, be able to actually care for the most vulnerable communities in their society. Social protection, we've seen the lack of that, literally forcing people to choose between death and disability on the one hand and poverty on the other. And across the lowest income countries in the world, the cost of being able to meet basic social protection measures in those countries would be just over $60 billion. Well, a tax of less than 1% on financial transactions across the European Union, that alone could render over 60 billion. And so I think we need to be looking at new measures, new forms of equitable taxation so that we can address this burden, give countries the ability to meet the own needs of their citizens, especially when crises like this occur. And one of the big measures at the moment is last year, the International Monetary Fund issued what's known as special drawing rights, a kind of reserve asset. And most of these special drawing rights went to the wealthiest countries. So we're calling on those in Europe, in North America, to reallocate over 100 billion collectively in order to meet the needs of this pandemic. So we need to start by first addressing these barriers to ensure something like this never happens again, and we're much more prepared for the next crisis.
Absolutely. Mr. Stanley, do you agree with the kind of setback that the pandemic has brought before us? Will we be able to achieve the target?
So just to start, there are no social protection programs in the real sense, as you will see in the Western world, where UK, US, Germany, and the rest of them were, sort of directly providing support for their citizens, especially during the pandemic. That sort of program barely exists on the continent, and there are myriad of reasons why they are unable. If anything, if they want to, the resources to make that sort of provision to socially protect the vulnerable people in the society, the resources is not there. But it doesn't mean that it's all of bad news on the continent. There are, from countries to country, from South Africa to Kenya, there are different approaches that, sort of poverty alleviation approaches that governments are adopting. A lot of them, from what we have seen, is focused on medium and small scale businesses as a way of indirect empowerment to families that rely on those small businesses. And I say this because on this continent, there are people whose daily living is earned on a daily basis. So every single day they are out of work, they are hungry. That's how bad it is. So by sustaining medium and small scale businesses, that these families, these literally hand to mouth sort of families rely on, by giving small scale businesses opportunity and support, then you indirectly impact their ability to sustain this side of families in their business. And I'll give a practical example. Here in Nigeria, where we operate, government has set up innovation fund, social protection program. They're increasing the number of people who they are adding to poverty, to the list of extreme poor families, who they are crediting about $10 a month. It sounds like very little amount, but that is a huge amount of families that rely on it. So we are seeing an increase in the number of social protection programs being put in place by these countries, right? But the challenge, as like I said before, is that recovery, not just from pandemic alone, but economic recovery, is all tied together, because the more Africa slides into poverty, and not just Africa, the low-income countries slide further deep into poverty, the worse it gets, the higher the risk it poses to the rich countries, because you then have all of this famine, conflict that we've seen around the world. So all of that poses direct danger to the rich countries. So nobody is isolated in this, right? So we, on the continent, we have just sort of launched an Africa-wide campaign on job creation, because we recognize that job is extremely critical, sustainable jobs. And we've gone around 8 countries asking what are the key priorities in terms of job creation, what sectors should we focus on, right? One answer we have found in the countries that we have worked in is that labor-intensive sectors tend to create more opportunities to to hire the extreme poor. And I'll give an example of a labor-intensive sector. If you decide to build a rail line here in Nigeria, directly you will hire between 10 to 15,000 direct labor on that project, right? But there are millions of other indirect ways that families benefit. There are people who are providing services to the workmen, food, water. There are all sorts of supply chain that are tied around that sort of labor-intensive projects when you embark on it. There is agro-processing, farming, there is trade, there is ICT here in Nigeria is providing a whole new world with little cost. People are now beginning to work for companies in the US and UK and everywhere else, right? And it's lifting families out of poverty. So there are little opportunities that we have, but there are those things that African government needs to do as we are learning. There are, constraints to job creation opportunities on the continent. Even before we ask others to provide capital, the business environment needs to improve. We need to do more to improve our ability to attract direct foreign investments on the continent. We need to remove legal and regulatory constraint that allows young people on the continent, because there's a huge population of young people, that allows young people to create jobs. We need to simplify our tax systems, because that is what is strangling businesses and limiting their opportunity to grow. Absolutely. Again, our campaign on jobs is all tied to private sector-led growth, because we know that is a sustainable growth process. So there are all sorts of programs that is being tried on the continent, and we recognize the constraint on the public purse, and we're asking partners to look at these opportunities, especially in terms of job creation, to help the continent recover with the rest of the world.
Mr. Cherian, so Mr. Stanley has spoken at length about the little opportunities that the governments in collaboration with several institutions are undertaking in Africa particularly. What about India? What are the kind of efforts that we are now undertaking to actually help our population that suffered, that had a huge impact during the pandemic? Will we need to re-strategize our efforts if we are to achieve the 2030 target?
India has made substantial efforts after the COVID pandemic, and both in the second wave and in the third wave. But what we have to look at is poverty is a multidimensional framework, and you have to look at education. So many children have dropped off going to school, and because of lack of digital access to either a cell phone or a tab or a computer, many children have even stopped studying. So our effort is now to put back these children back to school, and there is a big program of distribution of such tabs, which my organization CARE is trying to do in many parts of Bihar, Jharkhand, and in poorer areas. So what is happening is we have to look at education and educating the girl child, so that we see more of them coming into the thing. Coming to the health, there is an effort to universalize healthcare, because a lot of the deaths happen because many areas are suffering from lack of primary health care, and so that the comorbidities had killed a lot of people. So that's an area which we can put in, and that will also provide employment, that will also provide a fillip to it. And in Bihar, we are trying to reform the health system across Bihar and trying to do work with the public health system so that this can improve. And though providing oxygen and concentrators was only a small part of it, we need to actually now get into proper health care for the bulk of the people. And coming to employment, there has been a drop in employment, and nobody would argue that employment has not dropped. It is necessary now to put in rural employment schemes to revive, as Stanley said, the medium and small scale industries, so that they can come back to giving jobs. And there is also, India has done well in supply of rations, so food security did not suffer so much. But I think just giving food is not enough. We need to actually provide employment to so many millions of youth who are coming out of education. So there's a lot of effort which needs to be done in a multi-pronged way if we have to achieve the targets by 2030 and leaving no one behind.
Mr. Sheldrick, one final comment from you. We've spoken about how big the challenge is. In fact, we still continue to reel under the crisis. Also, the steps that the governments worldwide need to undertake. But what about the institutions, which also play a predominant role if we talk about tackling inequalities? So it is a collective effort, which all of you have pointed out. So going forth, the kind of role institutions such as the Global Citizen will be required to play to bridge the gap and also to make 2022 the year of action.
If we have a look deep down, some of the real drivers of this is complacency, neglect, and inaction on the part of our governments. And we actually saw how quickly the wealthiest governments can mobilize resources in response to a crisis. They were able to pull together and spend over $16 trillion stimulating their economies. And yet, when it comes to the needs of the poorest communities and countries in the world, that same level of support was found wanting. And it shouldn't be that way. And that's where citizens come in. Ultimately, citizens can demand action. There was that saying that, progress like justice is never a given. It's only taken. And that's taken by citizens standing up, such as arguably one of the greatest global citizens of our time, Nelson Mandela, did, such as other activists in the world have done. And that's what Global Citizen is there. It's a platform to create pressure, a platform for change.
Mr. Stanley, one final word from you on the way forward to make the world more equitable.
I would say that our recovery is tied together. And for us to have a better world, we all must treat each other as equals, and we must all look out for each other, because there is no nationalistic approach to bettering the world. It has to be a multilateral and a collective effort for all of us to end extreme poverty wherever they may exist in the world.
Absolutely. So very, very engaging and insightful discussion today with the three panelists who have joined me on the program from different parts of the world. And we've spoken at length on how the world must come together. It has to be a collective effort if we are to reduce inequalities of all kinds in the world that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So not just government, but institutions working in this area to also join hands and come up with solutions in the longer run to make the world more equitable, sustainable for our future generations. So with that, I'll have to wind up today's discussion, the Global Debate, this edition of Global Debate on Sunset TV. Thank you to all my panelists today for joining me on the program and sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. It was indeed a pleasure having you on this edition of the Global Debate. So that's it from us on the Global Debate today. Thanks very much to all our viewers for their time.